The sound of running water resonated through the walls as I strolled past my 60-year-old neighbor's bathroom. I did not intend to halt, but something about the situation made me pause. Before I knew it, I said something that altered everything. What happened next was completely unexpected and unlike anything I could have envisioned. The day began like any other, with the sun throwing a warm light over the calm neighborhood. I was in my kitchen, absent-mindedly drinking coffee and glancing out the window. My husband had departed for an early meeting, and the home was strangely quiet. It was one of those mornings where time seemed to stretch endlessly, each moment slower than the last. My thoughts drifted to Mr. Thompson, my neighbor. He was 60 years old, widowed for almost a decade, and living alone in the house next door. A retired carpenter with hands roughened by years of hard work, he was the kind of man who moved through life with quiet grace. His presence was steady, unassuming, and comforting in a way I hadn't fully appreciated until recently. I'd always liked him, though we weren't close. He'd been there for my husband and me when we first moved in, helping us fix the old fence that separated our properties and sharing gardening tips. Over time, our interactions had grown less frequent, but there was always a warmth to his smile when we crossed paths. That morning, however, I couldn't help but notice something different. The windows of his house were open and the sound of running water carried faintly through the air. At first I thought nothing of it, but as the minutes ticked by I grew restless. The water had been running for far too long, and an uneasy feeling began to settle in my chest. What if something was wrong? I tried to shake the thought away. Mr. Thompson was a strong, capable man. Surely he didn't need me barging in to check on him. But the longer I lay the harder it was to ignore the nagging worry in the back of my mind. What if he'd fallen? What if he needed help? Before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself walking across the lawn to his front door. It was slightly ajar, the faint scent of cedar wood and aftershave, wafting out into the crisp morning air. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I was overstepping, but the sound of the water continued, persistent and unyielding. I knocked softly, my voice trembling as I called out, "Mr. Thompson, are you okay?" There was no response. My heart began to race as I pushed the door open further. Stepping inside the living room was as tidy as ever, with neatly stacked books and a cozy armchair. By the window, everything seemed normal, but the sound of the water was louder, now drawing me toward the bathroom. "Mr. Thompson!" I called again, my voice louder. This time, as I approached the partially opened door, a wave of steam greeted me, carrying with it the unmistakable warmth of a hot shower. My hand trembled as I reached out to push the door open just enough to see inside, and then I froze there. He was standing under the cascade of water, his back to me. The streams ran over his broad shoulders, tracing the lines of muscle that spoke to years of hard labor. His silver hair clung to his neck, the droplets glinting like tiny jewels in the dim light of the bathroom. For a moment I was rooted to the spot, my breath caught in my throat. I knew I should turn away, retreat before he noticed me. But something held me there, a mixture of concern, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. He turned then, his movements slow and deliberate, as if sensing my presence. His eyes locked onto mine through the foggy mirror, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. I expected anger, embarrassment, maybe even shock, but his expression was calm, almost amused. Quickly, he grabbed a towel, wrapping it around his waist before stepping out of the shower. "Well," he said, his voice deep and steady, "this is unexpected. I'm so sorry." I stammered, my cheeks burning. I heard the water running and thought something was wrong. I didn't mean to. He held up a hand, a gentle smile, tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's okay," he said. "I should have locked the door. You were just being thoughtful." His response disarmed me. Most people would have been annoyed, maybe even furious, but he seemed entirely unbothered. If anything, he seemed grateful.
His composure only made me feel more flustered. "I'll leave," I mumbled, stepping back toward the door. I didn't mean to intrude. As I turned to go, his voice stopped me. No, wait." I paused, my heart pounding in my chest. "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere, "for checking on me. It's nice to know someone cares." His words lingered with me long after I returned to my house, my cheeks still flushed and my thoughts racing. It had been an innocent mistake, nothing more but the image of him under the water, the strength in his frame, the calmness in his gaze, refused to leave my mind. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment born of concern. But deep down I knew something had shifted, something that would spiral into something crazy. How he stood there and how I had seen him, it evoked something in me. Maybe, in that moment I couldn't give it a name. But after all, I'm quite sure it was the word excitement in some way. He definitely attracted me, and I needed to hold back before I started to do silly things. But everything was yet to come. The next morning, I woke with a strange heaviness in my chest, the events of the previous day replaying in my mind like a broken record. I had convinced myself it was just neighborly concern, but my lingering thoughts told a different story. I busied myself with chores, hoping the monotony of cleaning and organizing would chase the memory away. But it clung to me like a shadow. By the time I stepped outside to tend to the garden, the sun was high in the sky and the air buzzed with the sounds of a neighborhood alive with activity. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation. As my eyes darted to Mr. Thompson's house good morning, his deep voice called, startling me out of my thoughts. I turned to see him standing by the fence, his usual quiet smile in place. He was dressed casually in a button-up shirt rolled at the sleeves and a pair of well-worn jeans. Even in such simple attire, there was a presence about him, a calm confidence that seemed to draw people in. Wow. I'd never looked at him like this before, but he was really lovely in the morning, I said, attempting to seem nonchalant as I swept the dirt off my hands. "How is the garden getting along?" "It's a work in progress," he continued, leaning on the fence, "but it seems that someone is once again interested in it." I grinned, remembering how we worked together on his yard. It had been a while since I'd helped him tidy the flower beds and prune the overgrown shrubs. Back then, it had felt like nothing more than a kind gesture, but now even the thought of it made my pulse quicken. "You've done a great job," I said, genuinely impressed by how neat his yard looked. "Your wife would be proud." A flicker of sadness crossed his face, and I immediately regretted bringing her up. "She loved this garden," he said quietly. "I think working on it now is my way of keeping her memory alive." "That's beautiful," I said, my voice soft. "I'm sure she'd love that you're still taking care of it." He nodded, his gaze distant for a moment before meeting mine again. "I couldn't have done it without your help," he said. "You've been kinder to me than I deserve." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth rise in my cheeks. "You don't have to say that," I said quickly, brushing the hair from my face. "It's nothing, really." "It's not nothing," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "It's meant more to me than you know." For a moment we stood there in silence, the air between us thick with something unspoken. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt my heart hammering in my chest as his gaze lingered on mine, steady and searching. Finally he straightened, breaking the spell. "I should get back to it," he said, nodding toward his house. "Thank you again for everything." "Of course," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, as I watched him walk away. But that conversation made clear to me that something had happened between us that evoked something new, and that this definitely wasn't over yet, and I didn't want it to be over. However, the following days passed in a blur, but the memory of our conversation lingered like a persistent echo. I found myself looking for him whenever I was outside my heart, skipping a beat. Every time I caught sight of him, it was ridiculous.
I told myself he was my neighbor, a kind, widowed man who had shown me nothing but respect. Yet I couldn't deny the way my chest tightened every time our paths crossed. One afternoon, ere noon, as I was trimming the hedges along the side of my house, I heard his voice again. "You're quite the gardener." I turned to see him standing by the fence once more, his hands resting on the top rail. His smile was warm, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made my breath catch. "Just trying to keep up with you," I said, forcing a light laugh. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're far ahead of me. I still can't keep those rose bushes under control. Maybe I could take a look," I offered before I could stop myself. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." Later that evening, I found myself standing in his yard, pruning shears in hand, as I worked on the unruly bushes that lined the back fence. He stood nearby, his presence steady and reassuring as we worked side by side. The conversation flowed easily, each story he shared, drawing me further into his world. He talked about his wife, about the trips they'd taken, and the dreams they'd shared. His voice was rich with emotion, and I could feel the depth of his love for her in every word. But there was something else too, a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "You must miss her," I said softly, setting the shears aside every day. He admitted, his gaze fixed on the ground. "But life doesn't stop, does it? You just keep going." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The weight of his loss was palpable, and I felt a strange mix of sadness and admiration for the way he carried it. "You've been through a lot," I said, finally, "but you're still here, still taking care of this place." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "It's easier when someone reminds you what it feels like to care again," he said. His voice low, the words hung in the air, heavy and charged. My chest tightened, and I felt an overwhelming urge to step back to put some distance between us, but my feet refused to move. Instead, I stood there, caught in the pull of his gaze, my heart racing. "It is becoming late," I said, finally shattering the stillness. "I should go." He nodded, standing aside to give me room, and continued, "Thank you for your help. It means a lot." I managed a little grin before leaving and returning to my home. My thoughts are a tornado of emotions. What was I doing? He was my neighbor, a man twice my age, and yet I couldn't ignore the way he made me feel like I was truly seen for the first time in years. As I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the way he'd looked at me, the quiet intensity in his eyes. It was wrong, I told myself. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. I couldn't even sleep because I thought of him so much. It even made me excited, and I needed to see him, to visit him, and maybe even make my move, grab his and do what a woman is needed for. You know, or yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I looked at the photo of my husband and knew this wasn't right. I tried to put away my feelings and went to sleep, although I was sure I needed to do something to make this stop, either to make my move or to end it all in one of the upcoming days. I will make sure something shifts. However, the days that followed were a strange mix of longing and guilt. Every glance at Mr. Thompson's house sent my thoughts spiraling, and I caught myself lingering by the window more often than I cared to admit. My husband's business trip had been extended yet again, leaving me alone in the house with nothing but my restless thoughts for company. It wasn't just loneliness, it was the memory of Mr. Thompson's eyes on me, the way his voice seemed to wrap around me like a warm blanket. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't deny the spark that had ignited. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in a golden glow, I found myself wandering outside. The air was cool, the scent of freshly cut grass lingering in the breeze. I told myself I was just going for a walk, that it had nothing to do with the man next door, but my feet carried me toward the fence anyway. He was there as if he'd been waiting, His hands rested on the weathered wood, his gaze distant as he watched the sunset. When he noticed me approaching, his expression softened and he offered a small smile. "Evening," he said, his voice low and steady. "Evening," I replied, my heart racing. As I stepped closer, the space between us felt charged, the quiet of the moment, amplifying every unspoken word. For a while we stood there in silence, the golden light casting long shadows across the yard. It should have been awkward, but instead it felt peaceful, comfortable, even like we didn't need words to understand what was passing between us. "You ever feel like life moves too fast?" he asked, suddenly breaking the silence. His gaze was still fixed on the horizon, his voice thoughtful all the time. I admitted it feels like I'm always chasing something, but I don't even know what. He nodded, his expression distant. "I used to feel that way, always trying to keep up to do what was expected, but when my wife passed, it all stopped. Life slowed down whether I wanted it to or not." I looked at him, my chest tightening at the vulnerability in his voice. That must have been hard. I said softly, "It was," he admitted, "but it also made me realize how much I'd been missing, how much I'd taken for granted." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to say something to offer comfort, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was something raw and unfiltered about the way he was looking at me, like he was seeing straight through me. "You remind me of her, you know," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just how you look, but the way you carry yourself, the way you care." The words struck me like a blow in the chest, and for a time I couldn't breathe. I opened my lips to answer, but no sound emerged. Instead, I felt a weird combination of emotions rushing within me. Flattery, guilt, yearning, all colliding in a manner that made me shaky. "I am not her," I said. Finally, my voice trembles. "I could never be." "I know," he said, his gaze steady, "but you've brought something back into my life that I thought I'd lost forever, and for that I'll always be grateful." And then a silence fell. We looked each other in the eyes, and we knew what was about to happen. And so I did what I wanted to do for a long time. I kissed him, and he immediately kissed me back. Wow, it felt so amazing, but it wasn't for long. He pulled back and said, "Let's not make things complicated. You have a husband." "I know, Mr. Thompson. I know, but you are attracting me in a different way, and I have figured out I really want this. I need this." He was silent for a moment. "All right then," he said. "But we won't go further than kissing, not yet." And so I kissed him again, this time more intense. It was so exciting after that long kiss I pushed him away. "Okay, Mr. Thompson, until next time then," and I walked away, and so I went to bed. But of course I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, done, tearing at the ceiling as the memory of his lips and words replayed in my mind. He'd meant them as a compliment. I was sure of it, but they'd struck a chord I wasn't prepared to face. What was I doing? He was a kind, grieving man who deserved respect, not whatever this was. But even as I chastised myself, I couldn't deny the way he made me feel. It wasn't only his friendliness or the way he looked at me. It was the way he saw me that no one else had, as if I were more than simply a wife, neighbor, or woman going through the routines of life. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, examining my image with a critical eye. I couldn't remember the last time I dressed up or put on makeup just for myself, but today felt different. Maybe it was the restlessness bubbling inside me, or maybe it was the thought of seeing him again. But I felt the need to look better as the day wore on. I busied myself with chores, trying to ignore the anticipation that gnawed at the edges of my mind. But when I caught sight of him in his yard that afternoon, my heart skipped a beat. He was tending to the flower beds, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his brow furrowed in concentration. The sight of him so focused and at ease sent a wave of warmth through me. before I knew it. I was walking across the lawn, my steps hesitant but purposeful. He looked up as I approached his expression, softening into a smile. Couldn't stay away, huh? He teased, his tone light, but his eyes serious. Someone's got to make sure you're doing it right. I shot back, trying to mask my nerves with humor. He chuckled, stepping back to make room for me. Be my guest. We worked side by side, the conversation flowing easily as we tended to the overgrown bushes and weeds. But even as we laughed and traded stories, the tension between us was undeniable. Every accidental touch, every lingering glance. It was like a thread pulling tighter and tighter, threatening to snap at any moment. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the yard, we paused to admire our work. The garden looked better than it had in years, the flowers vibrant and the hedges neatly trimmed. But as we stood there side by side, it wasn't the garden I was thinking about. He responded, "You've done so much for this place." He spoke softly. "I do not believe I could have done it without you. You could have figured it out." I stated it quietly. "You are now more stronger than you realize." He turned to look at me, his eyes steady and penetrating, "As are you." The words lingered in the air, loaded with significance. My chest clenched and I was drawn to his stare like a magnet. Apparently it worked. As I closed the distance between us, the tension shifted and he grabbed me against him. "Oh yeah, am I so strong?" I said while grabbing his tool and moving it a bit. "Well, let's see if you are so strong." Then he said, and he grabbed my head while I went down. After a moment, he told me to get up again, and so I did. He turned me around, and I let it all happen. It was amazing, a feeling I had never felt before. After I think 10 to 20 minutes, he reached his moment, and so we were finished. "It's getting late," he said, his voice steady. "You should head home, right?" I said, the spell broken. "I'll see you around." "I guess thank you. Mr. Thompson, thank you as well. That was amazing until next time," he said. But as I walked back to my house, my heart pounding and my thoughts racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't seem to control. I threw myself into tasks around the house, trying to distract myself from the growing tension that seemed to live in the air. Yet every time I saw Mr. Thompson, whether it was a passing glance through the window or a chance meeting by the fence, my heart betrayed me. It raced faster than I wanted it to, reminding me of things I couldn't admit even to myself. It didn't help that my husband's absence seemed to stretch endlessly. His phone calls grew shorter, his texts more sporadic. I told myself it was just the nature of his work, that he wasn't intentionally pulling away, but the ache of loneliness didn't care for logic, and that loneliness had started to take a shape, a voice, a face, a presence that felt closer than it should. One evening, after pacing the kitchen for what felt like an hour, I decided to bake. It was a habit I developed over the years, a way to quiet my restless hands and ease my mind. The smell of warm cookies filled the house, wrapping me in a sense of comfort. I hadn't felt in days, but as I stared at the tray cooling on the counter, I realized I wasn't baking for myself. I was already halfway across the yard, the plate of cookies in hand, before I could talk myself out of it. The night was cool, the grass damp beneath my feet, and the glow of Mr. Thompson's living room window was like a beacon guiding me forward. I hesitated for a moment at his door, my breath catching in my throat before finally knocking. When he opened the door, the warmth of his smile was like stepping into sunlight for me. He asked, his eyes flicking to the plate in my hands, "Just thought you might like something sweet," I said, my voice more timid than I intended. His smile widened and he stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "You're spoiling me." He teased, his tone light, but his gaze steady. I followed him into the cozy living room, the scent of cedar and worn leather wrapping around me like a familiar hug. A fire crackled softly on the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I hadn't meant to stay. I'd planned to drop off the cookies and leave, but something about the warmth of the room, the way he looked at me, made it impossible to go. We sat together on the couch, the plate of cookies resting on the coffee table between us. The conversation started as it always did, easy and unassuming, drifting from his memories of his wife to stories of his younger years. But tonight, there was something different in the air. An intimacy I couldn't ignore, even as I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. As I set my glass of water down on the table, it tipped slightly, teetering on the edge. Before I caught it, his hand brushed against mine, and we both froze. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, the air between us suddenly thick with unspoken tension. When I looked up, his eyes were on mine, searching, questioning. "You don't have to stay if you're uncomfortable," he said quietly, his voice steady but hesitant. "I'm not uncomfortable," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. For a moment, neither of us moved. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound breaking the silence. Then, slowly he leaned closer, his hand brushing against mine again, this time deliberate. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The space between us seemed to dissolve, and when his lips met mine, it was gentle at first, almost hesitant, like he was giving me a chance to stop. But I didn't. The kiss deepened, driven. After months of wordless desire, his palm slid to my face, warm and firm, and I felt myself melt into him. Every idea, fear, and argument why this shouldn't be happening went into the background, leaving just the intensity of the present moment. It all occurred again. It felt like I was becoming hooked to it. When we eventually separated, our Betrayal mingled in the silence of the room. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Neither did I. I admitted my chest tight, but it doesn't feel wrong." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. "It doesn't," he agreed, "but that doesn't mean it's simple." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me. He was right. This was anything but simple. Yet in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. I left his house way later than I should have, the cool night air biting at my skin as I walked back to my own door. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, exhilaration, confusion, but beneath it all was a strange sense of clarity. Something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone, and as wrong as it might have been. I couldn't deny how alive it made me feel, but guilt has a way of creeping in, no matter how hard you try to push it away. Every time I saw my husband's name on my phone screen, a knot formed in my stomach. He didn't know. Of course he couldn't. But the weight of my secret grew heavier with each passing day, and one final evening. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in hues of gold and orange. The stillness of the moment was almost suffocating, and before I knew it, I was walking across the lawn again, my feet carrying me toward the fence. He was there, as if waiting for me. His hands rested on the top rail. His expression, calm but guarded, the sight of him, made my chest ache in a way that was becoming all too familiar. "I thought we were trying to forget," I said softly, stopping a few feet away. "So did I." He replied, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place, but some things aren't that easy. The words hung between us, heavy and charged. I wanted to say something, to ask him how he could seem so composed when I felt like I was falling apart, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was a sadness there, a quiet acceptance that made my throat tighten. "I don't regret it," he said, suddenly his gaze locking onto mine. "But I can't let it happen again, not if it means hurting you." "You didn't hurt me," I said quickly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "If anything, you made me feel." I trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence alive. Scene wanted the words, felt too heavy,
too vulnerable to say out loud. "I know," he said quietly, as if he'd read my thoughts, "but that doesn't make it right." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt tears prick my eyes. He was right, of course, this. Whatever it was could not endure. It wasn't fair to him, my husband, or myself, but knowing that made it even more difficult to let go. The following several weeks were characterized by an agonizing stillness. Mr. Thompson maintained his normal presence at the fence, which had been replaced by an empty yard that seemed colder than it should. I missed him more than I cared to admit the ache of his absence, a constant reminder of what we'd shared. My husband returned home, eventually, his presence filling the house with a warmth. I'd almost forgotten he was attentive, more so than usual, and I wondered if he sensed the change in me. But if he did, he didn't say anything, and I lacked the courage to bring it up. Life began to fall back into its familiar rhythm, but it was a rhythm that felt hollow now, the echoes of what had happened between Mr. Thompson and me lingering in the quiet moments. I told myself it was for the best that moving on was the only option. But a part of me knew I'd never truly forget. Months passed, and spring arrived, bringing with it a renewed energy to the neighborhood. Flowers, bloomed, birds sang, and the world seemed to come alive again. I threw myself into the garden, finding solace in the soil and the sun. But every time I looked at the fence, I thought of him. One morning, as I was trimming the hedges along the back of the yard, I heard his voice again. "You've been busy." I turned to see him standing by the fence, his smile faint but genuine. It was the first time we'd spoken in weeks, and the sight of him sent a rush of emotions through me, just trying to keep up. I said, forcing a lightness into my tone, "The weeds don't wait." He chuckled softly, the sound warming something inside me. "You've done a beautiful job," he said, his gaze lingering on the flowers. She'd be proud. The mention of his wife caught me off guard, but instead of the sadness I'd expected, his expression was calm, almost peaceful. "It's been a while since I felt like this place could be beautiful again," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you for that." "You did the work," I said quickly, feeling a blush creep into my cheeks. "I just gave you a little push." He smiled, then a smile that felt like a truce, a quiet acknowledgement of everything we'd been through sometimes. "That's all it takes," he said, "someone to remind you of what is important to keep on to." I nodded, my chest straining with the weight of his words. I'm delighted I could assist. I spoke quietly, and for a minute we stood there in stillness, the air between us thick with the unsaid. And suddenly, as if by tacit accord, he moved back, his hands resting on the fence. "Take care of yourself," he whispered in his voice. "Stay steady while also keeping you toasty." I replied, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded once before turning and walking back toward his house. I watched him go, the ache in my chest, both familiar and bittersweet. I knew this was the end of whatever had been between us, but instead of sadness, I felt a strange sense of peace. Life moved on as it always does. The connection between us became a memory, a quiet thread woven into the fabric of my life. I stayed with my husband, working to rebuild what had felt so fragile, and though it wasn't always easy, I found a way to move forward. But every now and then, when the house was quiet and the world felt still, I'd think of Mr. Thompson. I'd think about how he stared at me and made me feel noticed, in a manner I hadn't been in years. Despite knowing it was wrong, I couldn't help but appreciate the recollection. Some ties are not intended to endure, but it doesn't make them any less important. And while I cared to my garden, the flowers bloomed brightly and beautifully in the spring sunlight. I couldn't help but grin, knowing that certain moments, no matter how short, create an impression that time cannot erase.